Go ahead and just type here so I know your attendance. Very good. Welcome, Samantha. Good. Just type here so I know who's here for attendance. Everything is going well over here. Just hanging out, nothing crazy. Just chilling. This guy over here. This is his second session. Run his second session. He's loving this because he's from Havana. We are the official dog of Cuba, and we were talking about the last unit or last session that I did with my on-level U.S. history. So we will continue again with Cuba a little bit for this unit, right? Good, good. So wait for people just to kind of trickle in. So we're at 14. Oh, there we go, 15. And then I'll get started with just some announcements. And then, but you know what, actually, just to save us time, let's actually just start going over just a check-in on how you guys are doing, right? So can I have some of you guys? So let's update on that because I want to get your reflections just on some of those IB announcements. So just in terms of announcements for our class, so with these recordings, so we're going to continue to have these Zoom sessions. The session for Friday is canceled. It's canceled just because LAUSD has declared that it's a non-pupil day of attendance. So us teachers, we need to work, update our curriculum, get some trainings in, but there is no Zoom session Friday. And I'll go through that schedule completely. Also, one thing is, originally LAUSD said we couldn't use Zoom, and they said we could use Zoom, but one of the things that we're not allowed to do is record you guys, even though we're not using the camera. So what I'm doing is I'm recording the session, but every time that you guys participate, I'm going to pause it, and then what I'm going to do is unpause it and just paraphrase what you said. The chat box is still going to be open, though, and when I upload this on YouTube, I'll have a link, which is all the comments on the chat, so that way if you want to go back, and maybe you wanted to see, for example, Tommy's response or Ramon's response, Jasmine's response, because you feel it's going to benefit you on the essay, you could go back and check for it. Okay? So that's the update for Zoom. And as you all know already, of course, the external assessment for the IB exam has been canceled. IB, they're going through a lot. Everyone's going through a lot. No, we've never had to deal with these conditions before. And there is a lot of confusion. Yeah, so that's why, so going back to Zoom, I had to change the code for that. So if you know someone that's waiting in the other chat room, please let them know that this is the new chat room, send it to the group, and I had to change that. I believe I sent you guys a message today and also the other day, but the reason why we had to do that is because LAUSD wants us to use Schoology. But going back to IB exams, there's also a lot of confusion with that because what IB went ahead and did was they first sent the email to all examiners, so people that grade your test. They didn't send the email to any teachers, nor did they send it to all the IB coordinators. And then what they did was someone posted online, and of course that's how a lot of students were able to get the information. So as of right now, IB is looking to update us on Friday what this is going to look like. All of your external exams are canceled. So for my class, for history, paper 1, paper 2, and paper 3, you are not going to be evaluated on that in terms of IB. You will not sit in an exam and take those assessments. But now the confusion is, and what we're waiting on is how you will be examined, because there's a section in a paragraph that is vaguely stated that students will be rewarded their diploma or their certificate based on the rigor of standards that are implemented. And teachers don't know what that means. So we don't know if that's going to be the IA, that's going to be predicted grades, what the teachers always give. So there's some confusion with that. We will not know up until they said Friday will be announcement. So we might know tonight, we might know tomorrow morning. Whenever I hear information, I'll make sure to update you guys. All right. And some of you guys were, of course, thank you for emailing me right away. Just questions on our assessments, questions in our assignments, how the course is going to move forward. And I want to make sure I address those things to you guys because that's just fair. You're the ones that are putting the work in for this. So really quick, I just want to just spend a little bit of time, and I don't think our session is going to go a full hour and a half today, guys. So I just want to spend some time. I want to hear your input on it. my input's important, but your input. I mean, you're the students. This is your experience. I want you to briefly just reflect to me how you feel about those announcements and how you feel about all your classes moving on forward because there is no external examinations. I don't want to use this as a whining session. I just want to use this as a open discussion, right? Let's go for it. Alyssa, can you share for me?
I knew.
Okay. Very good. So in short, go through the due dates. By Sunday, have your reflection. If you're watching this video and because you weren't at the session, just make sure you take notes on the session, right? But that is it. All right, so let's move on. So here is where we are at. So today our goal is, so a future prompt that you might get is compare and contrast the policies of Mao and Fidel Castro, right? So I sent you guys a message. You want to have this PowerPoint open as well as the documents that I gave you guys. There's a timeline on Fidel's policies, and there's also a, and just this PowerPoint. Those are the things. And also you gave your document from last week, which was the long and short term, because I do want to look at Fidel Castro's speech. So what I'd like you to do first is I want you to watch this American news footage. And this is actually very surprising that it's American news footage. And I want you to just answer this response. How was Castro's acquisition of power different from Hitler and also Mao? So watch this footage, just explain the reaction, and also how was the reaction in his acquisition of power different from the other two leaders that we've discussed, right? So here is the video, and this is an American news source. Here is the video, and here's an American news source.
Often the mecca for gamblers sees the jackpot payoff of a political long shot. Bearing 26th of July banners, joyous followers of Fidel Castro sweep triumphantly through the Cuban capital hours after their rebellion had toppled the regime of Fulgencio Batista. The 26th of July refers to that day in 1953 when Castro began his long struggle to overthrow the dictator Batista with an abortive armed attack. With Batista in flight to the Dominican Republic, the celebrating soon turns to mob action and looting. Gambling machines get the axe. Other demonstrations at the University of Havana, where rebel leader Castro first gained prominence. He led student protests against the coup that brought Batista to power in 1952. American tourists who happen to be present when history is in the making seek refuge at the U.S. Embassy. They are taken safely to the airport. And flown back home to safety in the USA. Rebel fighters fresh from the battlefield in central Cuba pour into the capital to impose martial law and quell the rioting. Beards, a style established by Castro himself, are the uniform of the day for the rebels. Castro follows a more leisurely itinerary to Havana. When he began this campaign with a handful of men, he said, "I will be a hero or a martyr." At 31, he's very much a hero.
All right, so what I'd like you guys to do for me is in that chat, kind of just brainstorm. How was Castro's acquisition of power different from Hitler and Mao? And also, what is the reaction based on this source that we've looked at? So I'll give you guys some time, type it in the chat box, and I'll call on some people. Then we'll listen to some Silvio Rodriguez. So he is a famous Cuban musical artist. So just type in the chat box.
Es muy fácil dejarse amar como te estoy amando, mas yo no sé Si lo que quiero darte es lo que anhela tu corazón, yo te ofrezco el resto de las luchas de mi vida. Yo te ofrezco la senda que me queda por andar y hacer mía tus cosas más profundas y sentidas, y acaso restañar alguna herida que haya dejado en ti el amor. Yo te ofrezco que seas la alegría de mi vida. Yo te ofrezco, me inspires cada noche una canción, que tú seas mi eterna compañera de aventuras y dejes que le robe la ternura a tu profundo corazón. Y hacer mías tus cosas más profundas y sentidas, y acaso restañar alguna herida que haya dejado en ti el amor. Yo te ofrezco que seas la alegría de mi vida. Yo te ofrezco.
All right, so I'm going to stop you guys there. Just continue to get the comments in. I'm going to call on some students. I'm seeing some excellent analysis here. Thank you very much. Let's start off with Nupam. Can you kind of share? Just elaborate.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so well, Hitler, he also tried to do a coup, as we all know, during the Munich March with a small fraction of the army, but he was thwarted, he failed, and he was jailed instead. Fidel Castro, on the other hand, he managed to carry it out successfully with the not only the support of a military faction, but also the support of the public, who detested Bautista. Hitler also, interestingly, hijacked power from the power vacuum left over after the death of President Hindenburg. Hindenburg, yeah, I think it was Hindenburg,
Mhm.
and that's how like he got power. Whereas like he manipulated his way up there. Fidel, he took the support, he took the military, and he forcibly took power through a coup.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that's an important thing to understand is that Hitler originally tried it through a coup and he failed. Castro was successful. Hitler was more internal, his acquisition of power. Castro was more external. I mean, Hitler was able to manipulate a lot of the different parts of the Weimar Republic through Article 48, the Enabling Act, right? The Reichstag fire. Castro, mostly external. Everyone hated Batista. And it just came to the point where through the use of guerrilla warfare, right, he's able to kind of rise up. Excellent. Thank you very much. Chloe, because what you said was comparable to a Nupam and then expands on it more of just the perception of the rise of power. Can you elaborate?
Okay, I'm still typing about Castro versus Mao right now. But for Castro versus Hitler, you see that I think when you look at Castro's revolution, it was really like an outsider revolution where like he got the peasant support and the students and everything. Whereas Hitler was already a politician who had power and he just used that power to like remove the opposition. And then I think if you're looking at the way the United States received it, Castro's rise to power was relatively well received because the U.S. was worried about like their interest in Cuba, and Castro had not yet made it clear that he was extremely anti-U.S. Whereas Hitler, obviously, they knew that he was a crazy man, so they did not like it.
Right on, perfect. I love how you mentioned the perception of it, right? With when you're looking at Castro, there was the element of the unknown, right? And I think some would argue is that Castro was also not sure of how he was going to govern completely either, right? I mean, he gave his speech, but he knew the components, but in terms of American relations, right? I mean, he was definitely anti-American, but there was still that uncertainty. Versus Hitler, hey, we had an idea of just what the Nazi platform stood for. Excellent, very good. Alyssa, yeah, you're right. One thing that you want to mention is that both Mao and Castro were using guerrilla warfare, right? Guerrilla warfare tactics were successful with the acquisition of power. Hitler, not so much, right? Lila says Hitler was was an unpopular political takeover when he framed the other parties and wielded his own internal influence to grow power. Castro had the support of the public and used his external influence to rebel against Batista. Right on. Remember, at that point he was able to acquire just control over the Cuban government because there were so many different rebellions that were going on, and it was his movement that just had the most influence. Yep, House Tour. Yep, that was literally my whole house right there. Castro's acquisition of power was more supported by the U.S. at first, right, allowing him to have more foreign support, unlike Hitler and Mao. Castro was also quickly, he gained power, unlike the other two, for more public support. One thing I think that's important to look at is in terms of looking at Hitler or Castro was that he was, or Batista, sorry, was actually asked to step down, right? The United States wanted him to. Very good. Ramon, saw your hand up.
I was just gonna say that all three leaders kind of took advantage of the unrest that was happening in their own countries and capitalized on that to gain popular support. We saw in Cuba at that time, we saw the disillusionment with the regime of Batista in for Nazi Germany, or it was still Weimar at that time. We saw the burning of the Reichstag and how Hitler used that to, I guess, decimate his enemies, and Mao used the unrest that occurred after the Chinese Civil War or during the Civil War to gain power.
Yeah, I think that's one important similarity when you're looking at all these authoritarian dictators. It's all starting off from a time of instability, right? I mean, Hitler, you're looking at the Great Depression. Mao, right after World War II, Civil War, right? And then now Castro, you're looking at just the United States just brutalizing the Cuban economy during this time, and a lot of just the unsuccessful policies by Batista, right? Someone in my last class on level brought up a point, and one of the things that they said was they brought up a dictator, and they said that they named, I think, Napoleon was the only successful or was the only good dictator. And I kind of thought about that. Is there any such thing as a good dictator? I mean, is that possible to have what we call a good dictator? Yeah, Lila says, yeah, nope. Want to elaborate, Lila? Yeah.
I'm just mostly confused why they thought that Napoleon was a good dictator, let alone that good dictators are a thing. I feel like the very idea of being a dictator implies like suppressive rule. So I'm not sure why that's a good idea. And Napoleon wasn't even like the best leader, so I don't know why that person thought that.
Yeah. There was a lot of backlash towards that comment that was said. And Chloe kind of hit it too. Is governing without the consent of the governed is inherently bad. That's so true, right? So you might have people that are revolutionary, right? However, there comes a time when you're no longer governing with the consent of the majority of the population, where the only time, I mean, you might be considered a good dictator is for those that you are supporting. And in a lot of these cases that we're looking at, there is a large part of the population whose rights are going to be completely infringed or who have no rights whatsoever, right? But I just wanted to bring that up because that was something that kind of just like upset me a little bit. Yeah. But also, how do you know if the consent or manufactured consent? Like, how does the government have our consent right now? That's a great point. I mean, you're looking at also, yeah. I mean, I think that's the one point that we could really look at too, is looking at the way that elections are run, right? Yeah, that's one thing I think is very important to look at. Chloe says it doesn't have mine. I mean, you can look at approval ratings, right? I mean, we could just break down the election process in general, but that's for another day. Questions? So what I'm going to do is, because like I said, you guys are bringing up some excellent comments. I will save the chat box, and when I upload this onto YouTube, it'll be there's a link to it, so you guys can read through everything. Welcome, John. Yeah. So just a quick run through of because I felt like we went through Batista kind of quickly, but some things that were just terrible regarding the Batista organization. What was life like in Cuba during the 1950s? How did the United States feel about Batista? They supported Batista, but remember, by the end of his presidency, they actually wanted him to step down because he definitely did not rule, or he was not supported by the people. Things that they liked about him, or the U.S. loved about him, was he promoted U.S. investments. The U.S. controlled a lot of companies in terms of electricity and water for the people. And you better bet that Americans were making a lot of money out of this. A lot of these banks that were created in Cuba, these were U.S. banks. And once Castro comes to power, one of the things we'll talk about in 1960 that he does is he actually goes ahead and Che Guevara takes control of it, right? He gives Che control of those banks. They centralize it. U.S. controlled a greater part of Cuba's resources, including sugar, mineral rights, public utility concessions, cattle lands. So all these things are foreign owned, and because they're foreign owned, if they're not foreign owned, they're typically owned by the wealthiest group in Cuba, right? The Americans also would then go ahead and operate some of those military bases because of the Platt Amendment. And even when the Platt Amendment was withdrawn, still Guantanamo Bay is in control, right? And then we also have, 1 second, the U.S., you're looking at the industry. 32% of the Cuban sugar industry is owned, or of the Cuban industry is owned by the United States. So a lot of the wealth inequality that exists is because of the colonization and imperialism of the early 1900s, which doesn't stop in the 1930s, regardless, and 40s and 50s, regardless of our so-called good neighbor policy, right? So that's just a quick recap of some things that we covered last session. Let's move forward. Corruption. The Batista government, through your reading, was also very corrupt. Batista, he spent a lot of his the government funds on roads, promenades, monumental buildings, things that were looking to public works that would better Cuba in terms of external appearance, right? But when it came down just to the living standard of a lot of Cubans, while it was in some ways better than a lot of Latin American countries in terms of wealth, there was still a lot of inequality that existed. Schools, healthcare, and housing weren't necessarily getting the funding that it should have. Radio stations, when you're looking at public media, I mean, a lot of the media that was present through radio that was owned by the government, of course, was biased towards Batista. You're looking at 160 stations in the radio were owned by Batista compared to 60 in the UK and only 15 in France. 23 TV stations in Cuba compared to 12 in Mexico and 10 in Venezuela. So all the media that you were seeing in this time was, of course, supporting Batista, but that wasn't always the case. Casinos, right, and gambling, right? When you're looking at these elements, they would typically support Batista supporters only, right? Or the money and income was given to those that supported Batista, right? What Batista would often try to do with those that opposed him was, in the beginning stages, he would give them money. That was it. But you can only do that for a certain amount of time. Ramon, question.
Yeah, so for the bullet point that said 160 stations in Cuba compared to the 60, does that refer to government-controlled stations?
Yeah, so that's just looking at, those are the amount of government-controlled stations.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was just confused with the reference to Batista owned.
So you're looking at this as you're just not getting free press, right? He's trying his hardest to maintain that power. And if you were against Batista, what he would do originally was buy you out, but it came to the point where there's so many resources that are limited, and he couldn't do that. So he would just try ways to eliminate you. And remember, when it came down to free elections, elections were not even being had anymore. I mean, when Castro would go ahead and, of course, run against him, I mean, the elections were not considered valid. Batista would try to maintain the rule, and of course put Castro in prison, where we'll discuss that in a second. All right, moving forward. 1 second. Here it is. So where we left off last class is I want you to read Castro's "History Will Absolve Me" speech, right? I want you just to take a look at that document. I put it in our long-term effects, right, handout. I'm going to give you guys some time just to read it. And what I want you to do is just pick out certain quotes. Just skim through it. I want you to pick out certain quotes that mention how he is changing the government, or how he wants to change it, but more specifically, make connections to something that Batista did. So when we're looking at changes, I want you to bring up how that's going to be a change, right? So just skim through that document if you have it. I'm going to play for you some more music. But the document looks, I don't have the document open. You will read it in the, give me 1 second. Let me go in my files. It's the long-term and causes from last class. So you could open it up on Schoology. I'll open it up on my screen as well. Here it is. So you will see it at the very bottom. Excellent. I see you guys logging into it. I love it. I love it. Who's our anonymous beaver and anonymous crow? I always get nervous about that when I'm looking at someone else's document. I remember for track, I used to look at this one coach's statistics, and I saw that his photo was looking at the document, and I'm like, crap, does he know I'm looking at it too? So read this part right here, just for the sake of time. Just read the changes to the revolutionary laws, okay? So give you guys some time. We'll listen to more music whenever you are ready. And remember, we're looking at his proposed changes and how does this show a change for Batista. I'll give you guys a few minutes. When you are ready, just hit the yes button when you are ready. We'll listen to more Silvio Rodriguez.
Me inspires cada noche una canción, que tú seas mi eterna compañera de aventura y dejes que le robe la ternura a tu profundo corazón. Puede incendiarse el aire con mi canción. Si desato las voces de mi razón, tanto puedo contar de este largo luchar, de este sobrevivir y hacer la canción. canción, la más hermosa flor que yo supe ofrendar, tú eres para mí como una fuerza incontenible que me arrastra a mirar el lado hermoso de la vida. Canción, que me diste el secreto de alzarte en mi voz para alcanzar la luz que ha de alumbrarme en el silencio de las sombras cuando falte mi guitarra, cuando falte ya mi voz.
When you're finished, hit the yes button.
Canción, un nuevo trovador vendrá y te alzará en su voz y nuevamente yo estaré vibrando en su guitarra trovadora y en su voz. Canción.
Maybe about another minute.
Qué fácil es agitar un pañuelo a la tropa solar. De manifiesto marxista.
Right. So, if you can, just share for me what is Fidel Castro calling for in his speech, and how does it show a change from the rule of Batista? So, what are some things that you notice? Let's get Isaac. Go for it.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
So you're asking for what are the changes and how?
Yeah.
I can mention something specific. It says here the fourth revolutionary law that's granted all planters the right to share 55% of the sugar production. And I remember that before, like most of the sugar mills were owned by Americans and foreign-owned companies. So it's really like Castro nationalizing these sugar businesses.
Yes, excellent. You're looking at some of these profits being taken away from, of course, foreigners, right? Remember, Americas had owned a lot of this land. So you better bet that our government, the American government, was concerned about this. Other ones that you noticed? Any other ones? Just hit the raise your hand button. I'm seeing a lot of good things that we could bring up. Let's go Farhan and Chloe.
What I'm seeing is the main difference is that like the colonial lands are now owned by state mostly. So farmers were slowly taken away. Their profits were slowly taken away, and instead they had to go to the government. And secondly, they initially took the power from Batista and supposedly quote unquote gave it back to the people, and instead they became dictator.
Yeah. So I think this part looking at right here is the first revolutionary law would have returned the power to the people and proclaimed the Constitution of the 1940s supreme law of the state. So basically saying, hey, give the right to the people to rule, make it a sovereign state again, because Batista has turned too much and he's become too much of a fascist, right? He's killing his own people. Yeah, I think that's important to look at. Chloe, go for it.
Okay, you can hear me, right? Yeah, I'll say it again. Yeah. We look at the, I think the first and fifth revolutionary laws, that's a big political change. Then the second, third, and fourth are economic change. And obviously with the first and fifth revolutionary law, Batista was corrupt and he did ignore the Constitution of 1940 when he took over in 1952. So I think that's the biggest change you see politically, just recognizing the Constitution and ending that corruption that he did with like giving money to his supporters. And second, third, and fourth, obviously you're seeing like the socialist moving to the state ownership of land and, you know, giving land to peasants and everything.
Yeah, I think overall, and you guys are right on with this, is this move towards, of course, more of these socialist policies. And if you go through the rest of the speech, you could see this. It's because Batista has had so much corruption where only few are getting the economic benefits, and also that remember none of this is going to housing and schools, right, and healthcare. So those are some major concerns that Castro has in mind, right? So let's start looking through. So we talked about how he acquired power. So now let's start looking at, and we talked about that, how he was able to gain power. Of course, you want to understand the M26-7. You're looking at the movement that, of course, is able to overthrow Batista. And this should say concentration camps. I mean, Batista at this point was taking people that he felt were part of this movement. He was throwing in camps, punishing them. And you're getting just guerrilla war tactics that are used. It comes to the point where there are several factions that are trying to overthrow Batista. And of course, it's the M26-7 movement that has the strongest movement, therefore having Castro just being able to declare his power, right? So you are getting this government coup that exists. That video that you guys watched for me goes into depth on that, and your reading does as well from this text right here. So let's look at some of his policies. What I'd like you to do is just tell me what the Agrarian Land Reform of 1959 was, and how is it similar or different to Mao. So here is that policy.
Cuba's revolutionary transformation began on May 17, 1959, with the proclamation of the Agrarian Reform Law. Las Manacas, the Castro family farm, was the first land holding to be confiscated. Fidel's mother, Lina, was furious and would never forgive her son. $200,000 peasants received title to the land they had once worked. On July 26th, the anniversary of Moncada, they descended on Havana to celebrate.
When I first arrived in Havana from the countryside in 1941, everyone treated me with scorn. You see now how the rich, the middle classes welcomed the peasants of Havana in 1959 and put them up in their own homes was beautiful. As if everyone realized that there had to be an end to injustice.
As Castro surveyed the crowd of 1 million gathered on that day, he compared Cuba's new government to ancient Athens, except better, because Cuba's revolutionary government was not for the privileged classes or the oligarchy. This, he said, is true democracy.
Okay, so I want you to go ahead and just think back to Mao, right? Draw some comparisons and some contrast. If you want to go through your text as well in your book and go over what this Land Reform Act was and how is it similar and different to Mao. So give you some time, go ahead and do it, then we will discuss. Right? And then we'll also look at some of his financial policies.
Fácil es suspirar ante el gesto de un hombre que cumple un deber. O regalarle ropitas a la pobrecita hija del chofer. Qué fácil de enmascarar sin oportunidad. Qué fácil es de engañar a que no sabe leer. Cuántos colores, cuántas facetas tiene un pequeño burgués. Qué fácil es trascender con fama de original. Pero se sabe que entre los ciegos el tuerto tiende a mandar. Qué fácil de apuntalar sale la vieja moral. Que se disfraza de barricada de los que nunca tuvieron nada. Que bien prepara su máscara el pequeño burgués. Viva el
And I want you to think about what's going to happen to the foreign land. All right, let's talk about some of this. Eva, I see your hand up. Go for it.
I think that while the land was like, I guess, redistributed in both instances, there are two key distinctions that I was able to make. The first is that I think that based on this agrarian land reform video, it seems to me like the land was just kind of redistributed to peasants. However, in Mao's land redistribution, the land seized was put under collective ownership, communes, I believe.
Yeah.
And another key difference was that these communes came at the expense of the lives of the landlords in China, whereas in Cuba, I'm not sure if there were like mass killings based on like, class.
That's a good point. I think that you're bringing up is one thing is, and when you're looking at Mao, it was a lot more. The process was a lot more extreme, right? You're getting the agrarian land reform at the beginning, but then towards the after the 5-year plan, and then once you're getting towards a great leap forward, you're getting the establishment of communes. You're not necessarily getting that at this stage, right? So I'll go. I'm just going to read through some of these. Let's get. Actually, I'll have some of you guys share. John, is your microphone working? If it's not working, you could just. If it's working, if it's not working, type no. If it is working, then we'll hear your response. Okay, no problem, John. Okay, no problem. Lila, can you elaborate on yours?
Yeah, I think they had a similar concept of like, oh, we're giving land back to people who worked it, like land back to the workers. But they just did this in different ways because China was kind of going like fully communist with it and collectivizing it, but in doing so saying that they were giving it to workers by organizing them into communes, whereas Cuba did give land out in a more like individualist way while still keeping some for the state.
Yeah. And excellent. And kind of just to go over what Ivan as well as Hannah's saying here, in China there was much more denouncement of landlords, violence towards landlords. And John also brought up propaganda, right? Mao was using propaganda for these business owners and landlords to happily give those deeds over. And of course, with Mao, you're getting the development of the communes. In Cuba, remember, a lot of this land was also taken from foreigners, right? More specifically, U.S. business owners. And the U.S. business owners, they demanded, they're like, hey, you're taking this land, you got to pay us, right? And what Fidel says is, no, I mean, we're not going to necessarily pay you financially, but rather what we're going to do is we may pay you with trade in sugar, right? That's what he's saying, is we may pay you with trade in sugar. So, so understand that. That's one key difference as well, is with Cuba, he's also Castro is taking some of this land specifically from foreigners as well. So major difference. And although it is, remember, it's taking access land as well with Cuba. If these plots were too big, they would take it and redistribute it to the peasants, right? So you're not necessarily, it's nationalization, but you're not getting those communes that are set up, right? Does that make sense? Any questions? All right, very good. So one of the things that we'll also look at is the financial policies. I cannot, sorry, wow, that was a terrible scream. So I was not able to find this on YouTube, so I will have to go ahead and just take the whole site. 1 second. So I hate filming at this location. My wife, she decorated this whole back wall over here. I like it. I mean, I have a photo of Echo Park in the back that my wife selected. I don't know what that one is, I'll be honest with you. But this one right here, when I teach my AP Psych lessons, a student called me out on it because it's very embarrassing, but it says, yes, way rosé. Drinking rosé, drinking is bad in general, but I don't know, it kind of embarrasses me a little bit, but I need to charge my laptop. So, cheaters. Sorry, guys. I'm Here it is. That's the weirdest thing about working from home is my wife and I are together 24/7 now with our dogs. So, all right, here it is. So just take notes on Castro's financial policies. Can you guys see this okay? If you can, just hit the yes button. All right, perfect. So U.S. banks and Castro.
No one likes to feel stuck or held back, especially by your cloud. It's a problem. But the IBM Cloud is the most open and secure public cloud for business. It can manage all your apps and data anywhere without getting in your way.
The longtime former leader of this country, Fidel Castro, came to power January 1st, 1959 in a coup. At the time, he said he wasn't a communist. In fact, he insisted he wasn't when he went on NBC's Meet the Press just 5 months later. We all know now, of course, that is not true. He went on to seize every single business on the island, but he started that process with the American banks. It was September 1960. Newspapers across the United States carried front-page stories about how armed militias seized all the Cuban branches of First National City Bank of New York, which is now Citigroup, First National Bank of Boston, which is now Bank of America, and Chase Manhattan, now part of J.P. Morgan Chase. American banker Bill Rhodes was an executive at what was then National City Bank of New York when all those frightening events occurred.
We're always concerned about our employees first. And I think we were most concerned about what would happen to our Cuban employees because the foreigners, the Americans, and others who are working there could always leave.
Years later, Bill Rhodes would actually have a one-hour meeting with Fidel Castro where they smoked cohibas, and Castro asked for the meeting to get advice on what to do about the island's mounting debt problems. Debts, by the way, which are still unpaid today. In that meeting, which Bill Rhodes recounted in his book, Bankers of the World, Castro, he says, made a startling admission about a major mistake he made when it came to Cuba's financial system. He says, Castro said, he should have put his pal and rebel gun-toting friend Che Guevara in charge of the central bank.
He said, why I ever did that, I don't know, because obviously Che Guevara knew nothing about finance and banking. But he said, I put him in there because I guess I trusted him. But it was a mistake.
Those three banks still have big outstanding claims against the Cuban government worth millions of dollars, potentially billions, depending on how they get settled, Brian. So a lot of old stories coming forward as we start to approach this big event on Friday with John Kerry here at the opening of the U.S. Embassy.
Okay. So let me stop this before. I'm actually going to go to this timeline of relations that we get here. If you had this open, this would be great. But obviously what we end up getting here is that's going to be in 1960, that video. And what Castro ends up doing is he ends up taking power of a lot of the banks, or control of a lot of the banks, and more specifically the U.S. banks, right? And one of his biggest regrets, of course, is not necessarily getting any support from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which we'll discuss. So what I'd like you to do is looking at let's look at these years. Let's break down this timeline. Let's look at 1959. What I want you to do is look at the timeline of relations between Cuba, USA, and USSR. Look at the policies of Cuba, right? So this is what Cuba is doing. And I want you to look at the actions of the US and as well as Cuba. So in 1959, just read through that, and I just want you to make some inferences. What does this tell us about the interaction between Cuba and the United States? So these are all things that you can mention when we're looking at other leaders as well, comparing and contrasting. So take about a minute, just give me a claim or an observation that you notice.
Una mesa repleta cualquiera decide aplaudir. La caravana en harapos de todos los poderes. Desde un mantel importado y un vino añejado se lucha muy bien. Desde una casa gigante y un auto elegante se sufre también. En un amable festín se suele ver combatir.
So just write a claim or observation, and I'll call on some people.
Y hacer papeles para la historia, para que te haga un lugar. Qué fácil es protestar por la bomba que cayó a 1000 kilómetros del ropero y del refrigerador. Qué fácil es escribir algo que invite a la acción contra tiranos, contra asesinos, contra la cruz y el poder divino, siempre al alcance de la vidriera y el comedor. Viva el harapo, señor, y la mesa sin mantel. Viva el que vuela a calle fuera, a palabrota y burdel. Viva el harapo, señor, y la mesa sin mantel. Viva el que vuela a calle fuera, a palabrota y burdel. Viva el harapo, señor.
Yeah, let's talk about some of this. Samantha, can you kind of just share your observation, and then yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So what I observe is that there's only the U.S. doesn't take very much action, and I think this is because the U.S. already has a pretty tight hold over Cuba. So without having to take action, Cuba is already pretty reliant on the U.S. Like we can see how without the U.S. even taking action, Cuba, Castro visits the U.S. to discuss packages of U.S. aid. USA will only give money if Cuba follows guidelines and so on. So I think because US has already had such a big impact on Cuba,
yeah,
this already shows like how dependent Cuba is on the US.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever Cuba does only reflects back on how the rest of the world sees the US because of how reliant Cuba is on the US.
Excellent. Very good. Very good. So you look at those beginning stages, I think a strong claim that we can make is there is some reliancy on the United States in the first couple of months, right? Emma, can you share your response?
Yeah, I definitely think that because there was that situation in which the U.S. refuses to support financially Cuba in order to industrialize, is when Castro then turns to the land reform and the agrarian reform, in which now many U.S. businesses are being affected. And I think it's interesting how now when Castro is forced to turn to land reform to give land to peasants for like for financial gain for the peasants, because he wasn't able to industrialize because of the lack of support from the U.S. financially. Mm-hmm. How then the U.S. is now convinced that Cuba is communist.
Yes. Very good. So you're looking at these first three events here from January up until April, right? We are seeing this relationship between the United States and also Cuba. Like there is a relationship that exists, right? And one could argue that, I mean, that's going back to all the previous administrations, Batista. You could go back to the Platt Act as well, right? I mean, so there was still a lot of influence, but that influence is going to die by the time, not die completely, but it's definitely going to lower by the time May comes with the agrarian reform. One thing I want you to, can you explain to me, what is either the IMF or the OAS? What are those two? What's the purpose of these two organizations? The IMF as well as the OAS. And who knows? What are they? The OAS and the IMF. I think you guys know what the IMF. You've studied the IMF before. That's like an AP world term. It's also an AP US term. We actually just hit yesterday. So what is the IMF? If you want to do a quick Google and search and just get a quick refresher, I'm okay with that. But what is the IMF? Ramon, go for it.
I know that the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, was established after World War II, and it kind of facilitates global finance and gives out loans to countries who need a bailout when they're economically damaged. So kind of, yeah,
Yeah.
It loans to countries, basically.
Yeah. What type of requirements you need to meet in order to to get a loan? Any idea? Yeah. Does anyone know? What do you think? Chloe, go for it.
About the OAS?
Yeah, we'll go OAS, and then also, but before you do you know what type of requirements you need met in order um, to just get a loan from the IMF? Any idea?
I do not know.
Okay, so what's the OAS?
Based on the Google search I just did, it's the Organization of American States, and it's a place where like different states in the Americas they negotiate and discuss things, which is why that when the United States presented the like discussion on Cuba being a communist nation, they presented that to the OAS because that's just like American states in North and South America.
Yeah, think about it like remember it goes back to like the Monroe Doctrine, right? When we're looking at hey, the Western Hemisphere, we have our own governing force over here. In some ways, we should be free from what's going on in Europe. Think about that. I mean, that's what that is, right? And what Cuba tries to do is get a loan from them, but this loan is turned down. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and just like Ramon said, that this was created after World War II, right? So when you look at the IMF during this time, if you want to get a loan, there are certain requirements that need to be met. And of course, these requirements are things that are very pro-democratic, right? Things that, I mean, you're getting the stopping of communism during this time. I mean, these were requirements that were, of course, were going to be biased towards the United States, Great Britain. So keep that in mind, is that with the IMF, with Cuba trying to get a loan and aid for industrialization, it has to be requirements going to favor some of those more democratic powers, right? But when you're looking at here it is not, these loans are given to Cuba, right? And then that's when we start to see this turn of events where Cuba starts to become, there's heightened tension between them and the United States, right? Because remember, there's a lot of uncertainty that existed. So by 1959, you're getting Batista supporters executed. The Agrarian Reform Act, which we talked, happens in May of 1959. Once we get till 1960, we're starting to see some Soviet influence. The first deputy minister of USSR visits Cuba. A 5-year treaty is signed. The USSR is going to buy 5 million tons of sugar and give $100 million of credit to industrial machinery and material. Secretly agrees to send arms, right? Why would the United States start to be concerned about this? What do you think? Even though the arms are secret, but this treaty right here is not so secret. So why would the U.S. be concerned about this? So you could mention all this in some treaties. What do you think? Why would the U.S. be concerned about this? This right here in February of 1960. Go for it, Chloe. Or Ramon, sorry. Ramon has his hand up.
I was just going to say that this treaty kind of represented the the Soviets kind of gaining interest in the Western Hemisphere, and through having good relations with Cuba, that gives them a hand up in, I guess, controlling the dynamics in the relationship in that hemisphere, and that gave the U.S. Much reason to be concerned about, because it might lead to an escalation of tension between the two powers.
Yeah, right on. Very good. Excellent. Emma, want to add to it?
Yeah, I think we talked about this one before, and I think it was about how this treaty represents strengthening in the relationship between Cuba and the USSR, which to the US seems like the growth in communism and the communist influence, especially in an area with Cuba. And I think we mentioned how, or at least you talked about how now with the USSR having a close relationship with Cuba, they would be able to use Cuba as a place to attack US.
Yeah, excellent. You're getting the Red Scare, right? You were getting, I mean, remember prior to this, Harry Truman said that we should contain communism, right? And we're not getting this here. I mean, if it's getting less than 50 miles away from Miami, wow, that's a major concern. That's a huge threat for Americans. Then now what we end up getting is a policy, the first shipment of arms from USSR to Cuba, right? So Americans are very afraid of this. In fact, Eisenhower orders the CIA to train exiles for a future attack on Cuba. What is this attack called? Who knows? What is this going to be called when Eisenhower orders a CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, to train exiles for a future attack on Cuba? Right on, Alyssa. We're getting the Bay of Pigs, which we'll talk more about next lesson. But we're getting here is the Bay of Pigs. This is, when we're training the CIA, it's a fail, right? It's under the Kennedy administration, but in fairness to Kennedy, it was planned during the Eisenhower administration, right? We will chat a little. Well, actually, now that we have time, we'll talk about a lot of the other things that are going on in many of the Latin American states to stop communism. This is an important one in June, right? It says Castro seizes Texaco and Esso oil refineries after they refuse to accept Russian oil, right? Any idea who owns Texaco and Esso oil refineries? The U.S. Right on. So Cuba ends up obtaining some oil from the Soviet Union, but of course you need refineries, right, in order to process this oil and also store the oil. Well, the refineries that are present in Cuba were American ones, right? And he refuses, and Americans refuse to process this, so Castro ends up seizing them, right? So as you could see here, you're getting a lot of this rising tension between Cuba and the United States. What I want you to look at right now, though, and this is kind of a broad question, so I'm kind of just looking for a broad response. Let's look at foreign policy. Foreign policy right now between Castro, Mao, and also, those three, and Hitler. Would you consider these more similar or different foreign policies so far between Hitler, Mao, and also Hitler? Yeah, it's Hitler, Mao, and Castro. Sorry, guys, I'm having like but just broad before, because we haven't gone too much in depth with it. Would you consider their policies so far more similar or different? What do you think in the early stages? I'll give you some time. Just type it in.
Años atrás es mejor estar aquí.
Chloe, can you elaborate on that? Just because we have 4 minutes.
Yeah, if you're looking at the early stages of both the CCP and Castro's rule, they are both kind of relying on the USSR because that's the big communist nation at the time. So if any nation was trying to move towards socialist policies, the USSR would have been willing to help them out and keep them from the arms of the US and the capitalism, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And is Cuba doing anything really illegal here at this point? Are they breaking any treaties? What do you think? Are they? I mean, and that's open up to anybody. Is Cuba doing anything really illegal here? Alyssa, what do you think? So what do you mean they're just chilling?
Hold on.
Oh, hello?
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so I thought Cuba wasn't really doing anything. It's the US was just getting really nervous. Well, when they nationalized the oil thing, that was kind of iffy. But other than that, it wasn't really that bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agree to disagree. What do you think? I mean, is Cuba, because I think it's important to look at things let's look at it from everyone's point of view. Cuba's view, America's view, the Soviet Union's view. I mean, is Cuba doing anything wrong here? What do you think? I mean, I don't even like the word wrong, but are they at fault? I mean, for them here, for wanting to make a relationship with the USSR, for seizing these oil refineries. I mean, are they doing, based on what's happened in history so far, is there anything? Lila, go for it. Oh, Lila, can you hear me? Or John, whoever, because both of you guys have the yes button. So I don't know if you just forgot to. Are there any crimes yet? Thoughts? What do you think? Let's go, Hannah, what do you think?
I would say no, not yet, because like what we're looking at, like 1960. I mean, they do have like an alliance, a growing alliance with like the USSR,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not like well, looking at that one part, it says secretly agrees to send arms.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I wouldn't consider it like too criminal yet, but
yeah, I mean, I would agree with you at this point. It's just, it seems as if, I mean, America, of course, is very upset, and America's upset because these are things that are going against what our government wants. This is hurting us economically. It is, right? We're concerned about our oil refineries. We're concerned about sugar. We're concerned about the spread of communism. But when you're looking at Cuba here, I mean, Cuba at this point it's like literally like it's rising government. I mean, this is the first time when in a long time where they're getting a government that's supported by the people, right? Yeah, and the United States completely stops, right? They stop this as a result of the diplomatic relations kind of falling apart. So when we begin next class, what we're going to do is we'll talk about we're going to talk about the stop of sugar. We're going to look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. We'll also look at the Bay of Pigs, and then we'll also look at the Mariel boat lift, which a lot of people don't necessarily know about. So I think the Missile Crisis and Bay of Pigs is big, but the Mariel boat lift, if you get a chance, take a look at it over. It's really interesting of how this works. Any questions at all for me? Well, we are done for today. If there are no questions, just a reminder: all you got to do is take a look at your compare and contrast. Have it by Sunday, very quick. Just give me a Venn diagram, write me a paragraph response. That way, when I do give you an essay on this, it's not like it's all jumbled at one time. So you have something to look at. Turn it in on Schoology. Venn diagram is okay. But should look for me, look in email. I'll email you this weekend. Remember, there is no session. If you guys can, maybe let those that are not here, let them know that there is no session for Friday. I'll send you guys an update this weekend on whatever IB lets me know. Okay? Questions, comments, concerns? All right. We'll see you guys. Have a good rest of the day. Stay safe. Attendance, if you can, just type here one last time. And also, track kids, try not to run outside. I mean, stay safe, okay? I mean, keep your social distancing. I had one kid tell me that they were trying to go out and run a lot, and then their parent yelled at them. So be safe, okay? I know, I miss running. Yeah, I ran yesterday. I'm going to try to run today. I don't know where. Yeah, I read. Is that true? I haven't. But is it a misdemeanor? I need to stay up with my updates.